It looks as if it is indeed 6:30, so we are going to begin. Good evening. I'm Gail Barron, and I serve as CB8's Women and Families Committee co-chair, along with Peggy Price. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We have a very robust program this evening. Our first topic deals with domestic violence, which has worsened during the pandemic and which affects families, especially women and children, across the socioeconomic spectrum. As many of you know, October is Domestic Violence Month, and we're delighted to have 5 outstanding speakers with us who will address what more can be done to alleviate this problem. After our speakers and a Q&A period, we'll turn to our second topic, which is to discuss the potentiality of childcare being available during certain public meetings, including CB meetings as well. With that said, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Peggy.
Thank you very much, Gail, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Tonight, as Gail mentioned, we're commemorating National Domestic Violence Awareness Month with a dive into the status of this pernicious problem and what to do about it. Domestic violence knows no economic or social boundaries. On average, about 1 in 4 women and about 1 in 7 men have experienced severe physical violence at the hands of an intimate partner. And nationally, data show the problem further worsened during the pandemic. Tonight, we'll explore a range of issues, including causes and effects of domestic violence, help for victims, and ways to stop this scourge that most often affects women. To address these issues, our stellar panelists include State Assembly Member Rebecca C. Wright, Dr. Jane Mooney, sociology professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the CUNY Graduate Center, Fatma Zahra, Associate Director, Intimate Partner Violence Intervention at the National Network for Safe Communities at John Jay College, Sergeant Taisha Williams, Domestic Violence Officer at the 19th Police Precinct on Manhattan's Upper East Side, and Kelly Keaton, Line Assistant District Attorney at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Following their presentations, we will have a short Q&A period between the speakers and the audience. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get started with our first speaker, State Assembly Member Rebecca C. Wright. Rebecca?
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you to the co-chairs, Gail Barron and Peggy Price, for holding this important forum on domestic violence. And to my fellow speakers, Dr. Jane Mooney, Fatma Zahra, Sergeant Taisha Williams, and Kelly Keating. I'm so pleased to join you this evening. And the statistics really speak to the magnitude of this problem. Hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers face domestic violence, primarily women. More than 195,000 domestic violence orders of protections were issued in New York State in 2021, an 18% increase from 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated domestic violence problems. The statistics say that with calls to the New York State hotline, it was increased by nearly 34% from the onset of the public health crisis. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men have experienced contact sexual violence, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner during their lifetime. 54% of transgender individuals experience some form of intimate partner violence, IPV. African American women experience intimate partner violence at a rate of 35% higher than white women and 2.5 times higher than women of other races. 1 in 3 Latinas experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. More than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women, 84.3%, have experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And 1 in 5 of Asian or Pacific Islander women reported experiencing rape, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. It is clear that this problem broadly impacts communities of all backgrounds. When most people think about domestic violence, they think about physical abuse, but there are many tactics that abusive partners may use to maintain control. I'm proud to sponsor legislation requiring training and counseling to those found guilty of domestic violence. It is a necessary step to ensure perpetrators of domestic violence receive the professional help they need to break through the cycle. I'm also the sponsor of the Equality Amendment to protect all of our rights under the New York State Constitution. The Equality Amendment has passed both houses this past special session in July. It will require a second passage and then eligible to be voted on in a statewide referendum by the voters. And domestic violence can stem from sex discrimination and other intersections of our identity. Sexual violence is often a matter of consent and the lack of consent between partners. I've introduced legislation to define consent as freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement. Defining consent in New York's penal code is fundamental to determining if a crime of rape or sexual assault was committed. In the Assembly, we are working to protect DV survivors with legislation, and many bills that I've co-sponsored and supported have been signed by Governor Kathy Hochul. Legislation to require courts to order the seizure of firearms, rifles, and shotguns when an abusive partner willfully refuses to surrender them in defiance of a court order issued in connection with an order of protection. We have updated our procedures to require criminal and family court judges to inquire whether an individual they are subjecting to an order of protection possesses a firearm. While existing laws require these individuals to have their firearms licensed, revoked, or suspended, they did not previously require judges to pose this question. To protect the identity and information of survivors, we are enabling them to apply to the State Board of Elections to have their voter registration information sealed from public view. And legislation with the same goal has been signed for utility, wireless, cable, satellite, and telecommunications companies to allow individuals under shared contacts and survivors of domestic violence to opt out of such contract without fee, penalty, or charge. And the same for health insurance companies to allow survivors to seek medical and mental health services and to use their health insurance to pay for them without fear that insurance claims, forms, or billing correspondence will be sent to the address of the policyholder. Whether we're talking about gun safety, privacy rights, or financial abuse, we want New Yorkers to know that they have options, they have resources and protections. Help is available. I'm sure other speakers will repeat these and other resources, but I want you to please consider our office a resource for more information. You can also contact the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence Hotline for free. Confidential support 24/7 in most languages. Call 1-800-942-6906 or text 844-997-2121. You can also chat at opdv.ny.gov or call our district office at 212-288-4607. We're here as a resource for you. If you have ideas for additional legislation, we ask that you please reach out to us and to your legislators. Thank you for having me this evening, and I appreciate all your dedication and hard work on behalf of Community Board 8, both Gail and Peggy.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much for
Rebecca.
that extremely helpful and informative presentation. We are now going to hear from Dr. Jane Mooney of John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Dr. Mooney?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've worked in the area of domestic violence and been an advocate in the area of domestic violence for many years now. First in the UK, as you can probably tell from my accent, where I was very happy to develop the North London Domestic Violence Survey. You know, this is a long time ago now, but that's also important for us to think about. The North London Domestic Violence Survey was important in terms of trying to develop new ways of researching domestic violence, because as we know, it's very hidden and it's very difficult to come up with to find out about women's experiences. So this project was very important because it came up with baseline figures which served to raise awareness of the extent of domestic violence in the UK. More recently, I've been working with my colleague at John Jay, Dr. Yolanda Ortiz Rodriguez. We've been looking at the needs of specific groups of women, especially women who are undocumented. And we've also been researching the impact of the COVID lockdown on those who are experiencing domestic violence, and also the impact on agencies and access to those agencies. Now, violence in the home, if you think about it, violence in the home is often, typically described as this safe haven. And if you think back to those early days of lockdown, we heard that similar kind of rhetoric being used with those calls for shelter at home. And this idea of this safe haven in a heartless world. But as we've just heard from the figures that are quoted, for many women, the home is not a safe haven. And violence in the midst of a close relationship has, of course, occurred throughout history. But we've still got a long way to go, despite us knowing about the levels of domestic violence. We've still got a long way to go to confront the level that it remains endemic in the structures of our society. Now, I first became aware of the impact of domestic violence, and it was a long time ago, when I was a student in London. I was living in shared housing, student housing, and at the top of the building, there were 2 graduate students. Now, we were completely unaware that the man was inflicting violence on his girlfriend, which of course underscored the very hidden nature of the violence. This was a typical student housing with thin walls and so on. But it's important for us to recognize that few people know about domestic violence. Sometimes women tell no one. Sometimes they tell friends and relatives. Later, they might seek agency involvement. Anyway, in this incident, the woman asked myself and my roommate to help her move out, which of course we did. But her boyfriend came back in the middle of it all. And we tried to get help because there was a fight broke out, but we couldn't get help because at that time, and this is in the 1990s, the police would not come because they classed it as a domestic incident. And at that time in London, domestic violence was seen as unworthy of police time. Eventually they did come because the fight was in the street. So it was therefore classed as a public nuisance. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting by any means that policing is a solution to this. We're all very aware of how problematic policing can be, particularly in relation to this area. But why I'm using this is to underscore how difficult it was and still is to get help in a crisis situation. Now, the woman eventually went back to her boyfriend. And again, this is important because it demonstrated that domestic violence is a very complex issue. And the complexities of it still today, people, the public and agencies still fail to grasp. It's not like a fight in the street. Domestic violence takes place in an emotional relationship. Often the woman will hope things will get better. There may be family pressures. One woman I interviewed, she'd been hit in the stomach while pregnant. And it's not uncommon for domestic violence to begin and escalate during pregnancy. But it was her family who put pressure on her not to leave her husband. So, and they even said to her to consider herself on her own if she did leave. So imagine how trapped she felt. Of course, in many of these situations, there are children, which leads to considerable further pressures. Women think about what should they do? What is going to be best for their children? There are economic pressures. Where should we go? And of course, the fear of retaliation. In fact, the point when a woman does leave is often the most dangerous time. Now, since I did my first work in the UK, the statistics on domestic violence have not budged very much. As we heard, they've gone up a bit in the pandemic. But of course, even when we look at these statistics, we have to, as I said earlier, we have to acknowledge the persistence of a huge hidden figure, the fact that domestic violence is private. And so we've just heard some, staggering statistics. In the US, domestic violence still claims the lives of at least 3 women a day. And as we just heard, 1 in 3 are at risk of violence from a husband or boyfriend, including ex-partners, at some point in their lives. So we have to think about, that individual and the societal impact of this form of violence. And we should really pause to think about this. Now, it is, of course, somewhat of a truism to restate that old adage that domestic violence has no boundaries, because the level that it cuts across age, social class, sexual orientation, racial and cultural groups is, of course, well documented. But we have to be aware that women are not necessarily affected in the same way. We have to understand the specificity of experience, as well as that complexity that I just alluded to. We need to always think about that when we're actually trying to work out what measures can we take to try and help the situation. And this is why, concepts such as Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality is so important, to understand how the lives of women of colour are shaped and structured by multiple systems of oppression, especially those based on gender, race, class, age, sexual orientation and religion. This helps to provide an understanding of the lived experiences of women of colour and from other marginalised groups. We need to always be aware that the experience of domestic violence is going to be compounded by other social problems. And also, as we've just heard, it's important for us to understand that domestic violence is not just about physical violence. It is multifaceted. It's physical, it's sexual, it's emotional, it's economic, and other forms of controlling behavior. Although still many people are not aware of this, including the woman who is doing the experiencing. In fact, one woman we interviewed recently, she said she used to see domestic violence as only when your partner hit you. But now she associates it, as she said, with aggression, jealousy, possessiveness, checking your phone, not letting you go out. And indeed, it has become commonplace to talk about coercive control. And coercive control, of course, aims to damage a woman's sense of autonomy through behaviours that include intimidation, threats, surveillance, regulation of activities, social isolation, and so on. And often these behaviours are very subtle. If we think of a threat, for example, well, the threat is not necessarily, I'm going to hit you. But as one woman told us, she felt threatened when her husband walked into the room. It was how he looked at a cushion on the sofa. And of course, we must be careful not to see one form of violence as more damaging than another. It's about how its impact is felt. In fact, many women in my various studies have talked about emotional abuse and mental cruelty. Indeed, to quote another interviewee, she said, in my opinion, mental cruelty is equally as bad as physical violence, except the scars do not show and never heal. The long-term impact of that we must recognise. And in our recent work, stalking has emerged as a constant theme, and particularly when a relationship has ended, making it very hard for women to create safe spaces for many years to come. Also, importantly, we must acknowledge that all of these forms of violence will occur together, and they will have a compounding impact, whether they be emotional abuse or physical injury, or that which involves physical injury. So what can be done? And we're going to hear from other speakers of, I'm sure, some wonderful initiatives, and we've just heard of some wonderful initiatives too. But what can be done? Many of the women that I've interviewed feel they have few options, again, especially if they have children. Financial constraints are constantly cited. Finding an adequate place to live for them and their children, the difficulties of staying safe. Now, it's a perennial problem, a perennial challenge, isn't it? That you raise awareness But then you have to think about, well, what do we do about this? We know we have a problem, but what do we do? And it's extremely difficult to think about that long term. And that's what we need to do. As I said, this is, I began my work a very, very long time ago, and we still have the same figures. So what do we do? I mean, in the short term, as domestic violence is so complex, if we just think for a minute about, agency responses, well, focusing on one agency will not work. As I said, firstly, a lot of women do not go to agencies. But if they do, we could have, the best shelters imaginable. And we absolutely should. We absolutely need this. But that alone won't help. We could have the best social services agencies. And we absolutely need that too. But on its own, it won't help. Because of the complexities, what we need is a multi-pronged response. And it's essential that we start with the women themselves. We always have to remember that they've already felt disempowered by their situations. And then we have to be very careful not to disempower them further by taking away the choice of how to keep themselves and their children safe. A few themes that emerge from some of the recent work that I've been done is particularly the need for culturally competent services. Many of the women that I've interviewed cite language barriers, but also the need to incorporate cultural concepts and to understand cultural values. Indeed, as my colleague Yolanda Ortiz Rodriguez has stressed, that with respect to the Latinx community, to understand, the importance of family, religion, and respect, these are all key to culturally competent services. Thinking further, as I said, we've already heard of some very good initiatives, and there have been some very good campaigns, some very good public education campaigns in terms of raising awareness. But the problem is that these are often short term. But I do believe that public education campaigns can help with understanding the complexities of the situation. And as I said, the first port of call for help for women is usually friends and family. So that is where we need to make sure that people really understand what is happening so that they can support women. But to stress, we need to be very multi-pronged. We need to think about what we should be doing for victims and survivors. We need to think about how we should be intervening with offenders or potential offenders. We need to think about the role of the state. As I said, my current work is on deportation. And with this, we've been looking at the precariousness of women through their life experiences of violence, and then the compounding problem of the violence of the state and how difficult it is for that group of women to seek help. We live in a country where there is very little in terms of a welfare state, access to healthcare, and so on. We need to tackle all of these things. As I said, we also need to think about informal measures, which might be about public education campaigns in terms of friends and family. But longer term, we need to consider, as also was just touched on, we need to consider what to do about economic inequalities. We need to address gender dynamics. We need to think about, why is it that men are the most likely to use violence against women and men? We need to focus on preventative measures. And just to conclude, the reality is that domestic violence is endemic in society. And to try to make a change, to try to make a sizable reduction in its incidence and prevalence, demands substantial and long-term political commitments. We might say that, well, this costs too much money. But given the level of domestic violence, the social costs are already very high. And of course, they're damaging to so many lives. And ultimately, they're damaging to the fabric of our society. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a terrific presentation. Really learned a lot here. And let's move on now to Fatma Zahra, Associate Director, Intimate Partner Violence Intervention at the National Network for Safe Communities. Fatma?
Thank you so much for having me here. Really appreciate it. Good evening to everyone. So I was asked to speak a little bit about the impact of COVID on intimate partner violence victims and where they reached out for services and what services do victim survivors need now. So when the pandemic actually began, those working in the domestic violence field all had an immediate reaction to what could happen to victim survivors who would be forced to isolate with their abusers. We knew that domestic violence was an epidemic long before the days of COVID, but it was only talked about more once the pandemic actually started. The United Nations Population Fund forecasted an increase of 20% of new intimate partner violence incidents in the first 3 months of quarantine. And law enforcement and community advocates were holding their breath, knowing that stay-at-home orders would increase the frequency and also the severity of incidents. What everyone was fearing actually happened and revealed really concerning cracks in the systems that were set up to support victim survivors. Many hotlines and 911 centers received more calls for help, but we also saw in several cities where that was not occurring. 2 larger cities in where the national network works with saw that their numbers for intimate partner violence homicides and calls for service were an increase at an alarming rate. Another small jurisdiction we work with saw numbers for calls for service drop, but the severities of the crime actually increased. For this particular jurisdiction, individuals who were committing these DV offenses during the pandemic were actually individuals already known to the systems before. But this time, the abusers were more severe and more frequent in the intensity of their violent behavior. Systems have done their best in what they can do to address intimate partner violence prior to the pandemic, but during the pandemic, they fell apart and continue to work on rebuilding their response. Because of the early days of the pandemic, law enforcement, city agencies, and nonprofits directed their resources and attention to addressing how to keep people healthy and not exposed to the virus. People that were solely designated to address DV were pulled elsewhere. Even though we have come to realize how much more prevalent and dangerous DV has become during the pandemic, not all of these resources have shifted back to having just a DV focus. For example, some courts are still not able to hear cases in a quick manner as before. And we know that timeliness is everything when it comes to safety planning for a victim. Many social service providers have been stretched as well as others in the communities are asking for support services in regards to food, shelter, and mental health services. Although hotlines were functioning, many DV victims struggled to make those calls when isolating at home with their abusive partners. Additionally, the civil protests over the last few years have impacted DV victim survivors, especially those from Black and Brown communities, hesitant to call law enforcement for immediate help. While some victims may have always been hesitant in calling the police for help, many may feel even more so now. During the pandemic, many victim survivors were able to call hotlines, while other victims reported to law enforcement. And this reporting sometimes took place weeks or months after an incident took place. Other victims turned to family and community members. But honestly, most people in the field recognize that some victim survivors have still not had the chance to report. With COVID impacting economic and housing insecurity, many victim survivors may still not have had the safe window to reach out for support. Even though vaccinations and other attempts to curb COVID are promising and are making a dent in addressing the pandemic, the same really can't be said about domestic violence. The CDC still states that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will experience physical violence in their life. Those statistics affirm to us that we all know someone in our lives who have been or is currently impacted by domestic violence. It's still pervasive and will continue to impact communities unless there is a focused, holistic approach that will both support victim survivors and stop the individuals who are causing harm. Unfortunately, right now, the onus still remains on victim survivors to make the move to make contact for help and services. Little is actually done to stop those actually causing the harm. And there has been movement in addressing the behavior of those causing harm, but there's still many gaps and a lot of work to be done to catch up to where it needs to be. So we not only have to rebuild the resources and systems that existed before the pandemic, but we also have to think of new options. Domestic violence survivors are all different, and each will have a different path in how they seek help. We have to make sure that these options are not only available, but things that victim survivors can trust and depend on. Let's think of making law enforcement systems accessible for those who want to access them. The precedent that some law enforcement agencies had in evaluating and taking reports weeks and months after an incident took place should continue to be a standard practice. Another way for law enforcement to be accessible is to build trust and legitimacy with communities. Allow victim survivors to share their experiences with law enforcement and use that information to improve policies and protocols in the criminal justice system. Victim survivors also need providers to be flexible and creative. The pandemic taught us that we can and should do more. Providers can now offer telehealth services and are thinking more broadly about a victim survivor's safety, especially if they still have to live with the abuser. If emailing and texting is slightly safer, providers in the field should make that technology update to their systems to make this happen more often. In the past, there was always a push with service providers to get clients to come in, and try to have those conversations. But we know that that may just not always be possible. We've been flexible for the last few years, and we should continue to make that routine. Practitioners and providers have to think creatively of how these services can be provided remotely. Victim survivors need to be able to access services anywhere they go. This can be accessing, visibility of DV awareness and resources. This can be where victims are able to go out in a safe environment. When they're able to see this messaging around DV awareness and around resources, they'll understand that DV is not a private matter. Seeing hotline numbers and messages about DV at grocery stores, laundromats, and doctors' offices normalizes that this is another epidemic that society is taking seriously. This visibility also removes the shame and empowers victim survivors to consider getting more information and services. Victim survivors need to feel safe asking about help if they're going to a grocery store, applying for public benefits, or even going to the gym. I understand it's a lot for every person in a community to develop proficiency in all the DV dynamics and resources out there, especially in a place like New York City. But everyone in a community should know where to direct that individual for help. Doctors and teachers are constantly here and see a lot of things. They should develop familiarity with how to refer DV survivors for assistance. Just like how we know how to generally tell people where to get masks or a vaccination, the same should be true for domestic violence services.
Oh, thank you so much. That was very helpful and brought us up to date about the status of domestic violence in this pandemic era. That was terrific. Now we're going to get a more localized view from Sergeant Taisha Williams, who is the domestic violence officer at the 19th Police Precinct. Taisha?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Good. Thank you, Ms. Price, for asking me to speak this evening. And thank you for all of you. My name is Sergeant Williams, and I am the Domestic Violence Supervisor at the 19th Precinct. It is my pleasure to talk to you all about domestic violence, the trends on the Manhattan Upper East Side, and how the Upper East Side community, along with the 19th Precinct, can continue to keep families safe. Just a little background on my unit. The domestic violence unit in the 19th Precinct consists of 4 officers. I have 2 officers that work on the day tour and 2 officers that work the night shift. Twice a month, the 19th Precinct, we conduct community outreaches to raise awareness and connect and unite individuals. We do it at multiple locations, but one of our prominent locations is 86th Street in Lexington, where we have the train station and most of the stores, offices. So we try to make ourselves very visible to the community where they can see us. Some of the topics that we discuss: safety planning, sexual violence, teen dating, and how the police can help with domestic violence. We give recommendations on how to obtain order of protections, arrange to have your locks changed for free through a program called Project Safe, access to medical care and legal advice, emergency house transfer, and counseling support through Safe Horizon and the Family Justice Center. We also work with the PINS intervention program, where they will come to the home and do counseling with families who have a child that is at risk, and hopefully to get the families back together where they don't have to remove the child out of the home. Also, we also encourage everyone that if you are in an abusive home, and the abuser becomes violent, to call 911. And if you don't think you can call 911 at that time, you can text 911 and we will still get alerted. With that alert, we will not call you to alert the abuser. We will text you back and we will still make sure that we come to that location. 19th Precinct, we average approximately 113 domestic incident reports per month. Intimate partners and married relationship held the largest percentage of domestic violence. Some of this cause of domestic violence are mental health and frequent exposure to violence in the home. With domestic violence, not only does it affect the abuser, it also affects family members, friends, co-workers, and other witnesses, and the community at large. How can the community help? Is by calling 911. I often see when I take the train, if you see something, say something. But some people think that's just for unattended packages. I also like to think that we should think for that for domestic violence. If you can remain anonymous, but if you see something, definitely call, text 911, give a description, give a good location, and the police will come. Let's help keep families safe. Just a short story that happened 2 months ago. We received a call. 2 strangers were walking and they seen a woman being abused on the corner of 68th Street and Lexington Avenue. Once the abuser left, they approached the young lady and they asked her if she needed help and convinced her to come to the precinct and make a report. And with that being said, we were able to identify the offender, arrest the offender, and help the young lady get help, seek counseling through our Safe Horizon advocate and with the Family Justice Center. I want to continue to thank everyone. And I never was able to thank those women who came in. So I want to say thank you for the community on behalf of just helping us help others. And let's continue to keep families safe in the 19th Precinct. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sergeant Williams, for that excellent presentation. Before we move on to Kelly Keating, let me ask a quick question. You shared with us that there are 113 on average domestic violence reported cases per month in the precinct. Is that up or down, or is there a trend we could compare that with?
Yes, I will look into that for you. This month, it's been pretty high. During the summer, we don't get too many domestic violence incidents, but this month has been pretty high, pertaining more into the married relationship and intimate partner relationship.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So, Kelly Keating, who is line assistant district attorney in the Manhattan DA's office. Could you please share with us your perspectives on the domestic violence issue?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here speaking with all of you, and I've really appreciated hearing everyone else's insight so far in other spheres dealing with domestic violence crisis. So my office, I am an ADA at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. So my office handles all domestic violence arrests that are made in Manhattan. And we get those cases in a couple of different ways. The more or less common way is pre-arrest investigations, where a precinct or an officer or detective will bring us a case that we need to investigate to try to find the perpetrator. If they have fled, or the case needs more investigation and proof before an arrest can be made. More often, a case comes in to us post-arrest, and we call it the complaint room, ECAB, the Early Case Assessment Bureau, where cases will go after an arrest so that someone can write up the case and start the process of prosecution, excuse me. And like other people have mentioned, when we get domestic violence cases in ECAB, there's almost always a DV history. I think it's very rare that the first time something happens is when we get a case. And in speaking with survivors after we get the cases, they almost always disclose a history. Sometimes it's from the beginning of a relationship, sometimes it starts in the middle, but I have very, very few survivors come in who say this was totally out of the blue. And sometimes what they're actually arrested for is not the most serious thing that has happened to them, but it is the last straw for them sometimes. And when we prosecute these cases, our theory or our goal is to prosecute them keeping the dignity and well-being of survivors in mind at all times. So we want to ensure first and foremost their safety. And we want to make sure that they are shown the respect and compassion that they deserve in these cases. And we also want to ensure that abusers are held accountable and try to break some of these cycles between partners. Now, we have a lot of challenges in prosecuting these cases. A lot of times, the only witnesses to these cases are the survivor and the defendant. And oftentimes, survivors stop being cooperative in cases. And that's for so many different reasons that some of them have already been discussed. Pressure from family, they have children in common, which makes things very complicated. Financial dependence is very common, what I see. They depend on a partner for income, for housing, or their family provides child support, babysitting. Another common thing I see is that the survivors lack support systems. I think we all know that a very common tactic of an abuser is to isolate survivors so that they lose that support system, they lose that ability to turn to other people. And sometimes we see, a distrust of the police, of us, of the system as a whole. Sometimes they've just already been let down by the criminal justice system. They have called the police before, arrests have been made before, and they feel like nothing has happened. And so they just get tired. And the process in the criminal justice system can be very slow. Cases don't move very fast, unfortunately. And it's just inconvenient to even just get down to my office sometimes for an interview. And then, as time goes on, sometimes they get back together with their abuser, or they just decide, look, he was arrested. I just can't do this anymore. And usually when these things happen, we try our best really to identify the root, like what is actually driving them to not want to participate in the process. And we have a witness aid services unit that can try to address as many of those issues as possible. So for example, we can offer a car service that takes survivors and their children to our office. And we, if there are really serious safety concerns, someone doesn't want to cooperate because they're terrified of their abuser, we can change their locks for them. We can help them get emergency housing transfers. We can install panic buttons in their apartments where you just have to press a button and then 911 is automatically called for them. And because we have such a challenge with keeping survivors with us during the entire pendency of a case, we always keep in mind when we get these cases that we may lose the survivor. And so we focus on evidence-based prosecution. It's really important to hold abusers accountable. And so how do we do that if we don't have the testimony of the survivor? And so we will do our best to do things like order jail calls. And I'll tell you that almost every time a defendant is incarcerated, they are calling the survivor. And that's always a violation of the order of protection, which is a new crime. We try to get phone records, try to see if there are neighbors who have ever heard anything or know of a history of abuse, video cameras that might show a defendant fleeing the survivor's apartment after she calls 911. Anything that we can really to get as much evidence that we can in order to move forward with these cases. And a lot of times, that includes medical records. And again, Rikers calls are a really valuable tool for us. And we also, as Dr. Mooney was explaining, these intricacies and the complications that come with these cases, we use expert witnesses a lot who can testify to explain behavior that might seem counterintuitive on the surface, and why people might not explain why a survivor does what they do. I think that it's a really horribly pernicious attitude that, oh, they got back together, this is no big deal. And so having an expert witness testify or be involved is really, really helpful to kind of explain what's really going on. And so what my office is doing to better prosecute these cases, we're actually completely retooling our domestic violence unit. So our domestic violence unit is part of the Special Victims Bureau in my office, which involves human trafficking, elder abuse, sex crimes, child abuse. And before, our DV unit had supervisors, but not a lot of ADAs handling cases directly. So now we're putting more full-time ADAs into that unit, including myself. I'm moving to that unit next month, where the people who are the most dedicated to these cases are the ones prosecuting them. We think that that will lead to better results within the criminal justice system, and especially on the most serious cases, but even on the cases that are a lower level of crime in the penal law. We'll still be working with other assistants on those cases to make sure that they are prosecuted the best way that we can. And so we're really optimistic and hopeful that retooling this unit and adding more ADAs is going to really enhance our ability to get justice for survivors.
Terrific. That is extremely helpful. And thank you for bringing us up to date on what the DA's office is doing. We will now take questions from participants. If you have a question, please raise your hand. You'll find the virtual hand icon under reactions at the bottom of your screen. Click on reactions and then click on raise hand if you do. Alita?
Peggy, we also have a member of the public with a raised hand.
Oh, so sorry. I didn't see that. Oh, I'm sorry. Erica, please. Yes. Go ahead.
Hi there. I'm a lay member of the Social Justice Committee, and I have a lot of experience with this topic, and I appreciate what the first three speakers brought to the table. In the early 90s, I experienced an issue with a boyfriend that I broke up with who ended up stalking me, and court cases that went on for quite some time. At that point, they didn't have many laws on the books about this, but fast forward many years, and I've been involved with the domestic violence community, both as a volunteer and pro bono for probably 13 or 14 years on and off. My stepmom was on the board of the Center Against Domestic Violence for 10 years, which is now part of the research. I always bungle this. The NRI, I think, but what, and then most recently, the DA Bragg's office is prosecuting a friend of mine who is a criminalized survivor of long-term domestic abuse. And what I don't hear, and where this conversation isn't complete, is the fact that women have two choices typically. They can either survive or they can die. And when they do survive, in a lot of the cases, offices like DA Bragg go after them and criminalize them and put them in jail for decades. There are many cases like this, and 80% of women who are in prison right now are as a result of being a criminalized survivor. And at last count, 68 to 70% of those women are Black, brown, and poor women. And as it turns out, my friend Tracy is a Black woman who's being prosecuted right now by DA Bragg's office. So what I'm not hearing from any of the presenters, minus Ms. Keating, is a conversation that's not complete, because you're talking about resources, but you're also not talking about the fact that women, again, have two choices. They can survive, which is for most of them not necessarily surviving. It's certainly not thriving, what many poor women end up with in these cases. But either that or they can end up dead, because what happens in between that, it is not preferential for anyone I know who's gone through this. And this knows no socioeconomic background. This doesn't discriminate against color. It doesn't discriminate against age. Women from all ages, women from all socioeconomic backgrounds have been subjected to this, along with men. I know I have a close friend who's a man who was abused by his wife, and no one believed, like, people didn't believe him. And it's why he didn't want to come forward. But I am exhausted by the fact that I have seen nonstop during DA Bragg's campaigning, and he campaigned actually on the back of my friend Tracy, that he would drop the charges if he became the DA, because she was indicted under Cy Vance. So I feel like these conversations are largely incomplete, because again, women have the option of surviving, which doesn't necessarily mean thriving, or ending up dead as a result.
Okay, so if it's all right, I'd like to ask Kelly if she'd respond. Also, and in your response, would you do something, Kelly? Would you elaborate just a little bit more about what you call the retooling of the DA's office and how that might play into what Erica is talking about?
Of course. So I will say that I cannot comment on an ongoing prosecution in my office, and I will say I am not handling that case, and I would not want to speak on behalf of the assistant district attorneys who are. And so, unfortunately, Erica, I'm sorry, I don't have anything to add to your friend's situation in particular. But I completely understand what you're saying in terms of survivors can end up dying. And we do see that in the domestic violence unit. And that's part of the retooling, is that this more dedicated group of ADAs will be focusing on some of those most serious cases, when homicides involving domestic violence come in, when very serious assaults come in. Because the way that cases come in, certain ADAs will staff our complaint room on different days, and it can kind of be the luck of the draw in terms of who gets what cases. It just depends on who's assigned to the complaint room that day and who is assigning cases out to other assistants. And sometimes you have serious DV cases that come in and they end up going to an ADA who may not be as interested in those kinds of cases. And so with the new retooling of the unit, assistants like myself and several other ADAs in the office will be dedicated to and handling those cases to make sure that they're getting to people who are committed to ensuring that justice is done on those cases, and will be better equipped to handle those cases with the resources of the DV unit, like dedicated paralegals and investigators, so that we have a better ability to prosecute those cases.
Thanks. And before I call on Alida, do you know how many more DAs are being assigned to the domestic violence unit?
Right now, I don't know, because things are shifting all the time, and I know that right now I think I can't say for sure. I think there are about at least a dozen people moving to do the more serious cases, and I think that the unit is planning to expand as the unit kind of gets its footing, since this is brand new. And once we figure out exactly how this is going to work practically, then we'll bring on as many people as we can.
Okay.
Thank you, Peggy.
Yeah.
I noticed that Dr. Mooney as well as Fatma had their hands raised, and they may want to add something about this particular question.
Yeah,
Dr. Mooney.
and then Miss Zara.
Hi, yes, Erica, I mean, you're so right. I mean, what you said is just, it underscores the whole seriousness of it. Is that you just summed it up, and that is the problem of, you know, we can't just rely on agencies, because sometimes agencies make it worse. The criminal justice system can make it worse, and we have to think about the whole problem of retaliation and the fact that domestic violence is so persistent, which is why I think we have to be always, you know, I was trying to say, the complexities of it is not like an assault in the street. You know, when you think, I mean, a woman that I'm still in touch with, she moved 3 countries to get away from her abuser, 3 countries. And she thought that she was away from him. She came down from her apartment building one day to find her abuser in the lobby. That's what it's like. And you know, when you think, so it's about the long-term effects, and also when you think about the impact on women, that even when we, you know, we talk about the numbers of women who die at the hands of their abusers, but as you said, yeah, the psychological impact, the number of women who actually die by suicide because of it. We just cannot, you totally summed it up, and totally summed up about the complexities of it. That when you're not dealing like with a punch in the street, it's just not like that. And because it's within a relationship, with all of that means, makes it so difficult. And you know, I do hope everything works out, I really do, but it is hard. And thank you so much for saying that. It really needed to be said.
Thank you. Fatma?
Yes, Erica, thank you for naming how complex and messy domestic violence, intimate partner violence can be. And it requires a great deal of time, analysis, and conversation. You know, we didn't get a chance to really talk about the intimate partner violence intervention that we have here at the National Network for Safe Communities. But part of the work that we do through that intervention is, as messaging and actions are taken for those that are identified as abusers in communities, there's a special task force that has a chance to talk about and review, you know, what's going on, assessing who's the primary aggressor here, what's the history that we know of, you know, how do we evaluate before we take this next step and action? How do we take into consideration what you know, this agency may know about this victim or about this person who's causing harm? Some of that context helps in being able to name and think about next steps and actions, and not just seeing that incident as the incident, but looking at the larger picture. So the intimate partner violence intervention here at the National Network, we're implementing in a few cities. It really is a, you know, community coordinated response to looking at a situation and incident, to help kind of mitigate some of those situations that, you know, you're referencing and talking about, not just looking at it as that one incident, but looking at all the players and thinking about the offending history.
Thank you very much. A quick question before I go to Alida. So it's another question for Kelly. I'm just wondering, in this new retooled unit in the DA's office, has there been any goal defined yet about what the ultimate aim is with this restructuring? How it might lessen the problem of domestic violence in New York? Is there any kind of goal yet that's been articulated?
So the goal is to ensure the dignity of survivors. You know, that looks different for each person. And I know that in terms of handling domestic violence outside of just the criminal justice system, we have plans to, you know, try to go to conferences and do more meetings with, you know, the community like this one. And we go to high schools and middle schools and elementary schools to talk about what domestic violence can look like and how to handle that. So we try to really get into the community and meet people and put our faces out there as people who are trying to deal with this problem, and to try to tell people from a younger age, this is abusive behavior and that this is not acceptable. And if it does happen, here is what you can do. And so we think that by really getting out there and doing as much as we can to speak with other people, that we can bring awareness and hopefully reduce the actual incidence of domestic violence in the city.
Thank you very much. Alita?
Thank you. This is a great program. Thank you so much for putting this together, Peggy and Gail. I have a question and then a couple of comments. My question is for the person, I think it was Fatma, who talked about physicians and teachers recognizing symptoms or injuries. Is there an obligation with doctors or to report the way there might be with child abuse when it's suspected with women? And if there is, how does HIPAA or anything affect that? Is it different because it's criminal?
Great question. So not the same obligation as there is in child abuse cases to make a report, unless I believe there is a weapon, like a gun that was involved in a domestic incident. So there's no precedent, and perhaps Sergeant Williams and ADA Heating can jump in on that. I don't remember all the legal specificities, but there's nothing specific around that here in New York State. So no obligation. And it's complex, right? Doctors and physicians have the ability to have that first line of intervention. And they're seen as safe people. They're not the police. They're not the DA's office. They're not even a formal DV organization. So they could actually, even though they're not mandated reporters, they have an opportunity to have really important, rich conversations with a domestic violence survivor in that moment, without them feeling on guard that, oh my gosh, I'm going to feel obligated to make a police report, or this case is going to go to the DA's office. So there's something that's really positive about that neutrality, so that doctors are able to talk about domestic violence in a non-legal way. They're able to talk about it like, you have these bruisings. I'm worried about, what these bruisings, these broken bones may do to you. So having conversations about domestic violence in a different perspective and way is another angle and way to reach, different DV survivors.
Thank you. So one of my comments is that there still seems to be either a stigma or a lack of importance attributed to domestic violence, particularly with people who bring money into an institution such as elite athletes or entertainers, that there seems to still be some kind of inclination to disbelieve either the survivor or think that nothing's happened because there's money at stake. And it seems that needs to change. So that's one comment. My other is that one of my kids is involved in a different type of intervention. She works in, I think she said it's the Victim Intervention Project at New York Presbyterian, where she was trained for hours and hours and hours to serve as an advocate for both sexual assault and domestic violence victims when they come into the emergency room, and talking with doctors or talking to the police as necessary. And so if anyone listening is interested in participating in a program like that, it's another way to be involved that has very positive impacts on people who are brought to the emergency room. I know she's, without revealing, she hasn't revealed to me any anonymous details, but the idea that you can serve and help people get to a shelter or give them access to resources is a very tangible way to help individuals in that. So I imagine if New York Presbyterian has that program, that other hospitals probably do as well. Thanks so much again, everyone, and Peggy and Gail.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth?
Yes, I wanted to bring up something that I support with a few pennies to charities, that people who provide or support accommodation for domestic violence people's victims' pets, because women stay with an abuser to protect their pets, and then they continue to get beaten up or killed, or they leave the pets behind, and the pets get beaten up or killed. And in many cases, to protect their pets, they'll go back to an abuser and then still get beaten up. So I think that providing advice, resources, and accommodation for pets for the victims protects everybody around. I think it perhaps isn't widely recognized, but I can give you a couple of charities that I support, but many of them do. There are several on the list, and I think that as people develop shelters and programs, being aware of this danger, I think, is very important.
Thank you. Would someone like to comment? Any of the speakers like to comment? Is there any or enough attention to this issue of providing for the pets of a victim of domestic violence? Yes. Dr. Moody?
Yes, no, I agree completely. I think, that's, when, that's all part of the complexity. People just think that, why doesn't somebody leave? If it was me, I would just leave. So they don't realize there's all of these other things going on. And you're right. Yes, I saw that recently. There is a drive to help, women who have their animals, and because shelters, of course, won't take them. And also it might not be feasibly possible in terms of financial constraints. And it's also true, as you pointed out, that the abusers often do then turn on the animals as a way of control, because they really want to hurt the woman. And the way to hurt the woman is through her animals, So I think it's a wonderful initiative.
I was thinking of one thing. Over the years, Peggy and I have put together white papers on issues ranging from the pink tax to things like food insecurity. And if the speakers with us today would be so kind as to just email us with resources which you believe would really be helpful. I'll find out about the pet charities from Elizabeth. This could be very valuable because, as was pointed out, victims of abuse are not comfortable necessarily reaching out easily, and it takes a lot of education and a comfort level. And if we could put together a white paper, then have it on our website and decide where else in the community we might be able to provide that information, working with the 19th precinct, with those of you who have been so gracious as to agree to be speakers, I think that could be really extremely valuable. And I see that Sandrea has her hand up. And I understand it's your birthday, Sandrea. Happy birthday. We really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, sorry I'm late, but thank you for that. And thank you for this conversation. I want to make a comment, then I have to ask a question. So love isn't supposed to hurt. As a domestic violence survivor, I'm reminded of the outcomes of victims. Some survive, but their lives aren't the same. Some are in prison because they fought back, and some are even dead. So with that said, and that's a comment I like to remind people of when it comes to domestic violence. I have a question, like I said, as a domestic violence victim. Many years ago in the 90s, my ex-spouse, when I got him arrested, and I was actually working out of the 19th precinct at that time, And I would have to go into work maybe 5 in the morning, to get away from my, my abuse. But he was arrested back then. So this was the 90s. So I want to know if there's been any change. He was able to return back home with the order of protection in place. So I wanted to know, has that been changed? Like if there's a domestic, I mean, we're divorced and everything, so it's over and I'm here and I'm not in jail and I'm alive and he's alive. But, that's not always the outcome. So my question is, when these incidents happen in the homes, what is being done now with the marital or people that live together, or are they able to return home with an order of protection in place like I had to experience? Because that was, it was walking on eggshells. It was very horrendous. It was hard to live like that, So I wanted to know, has that stopped or is that still happening? Can someone answer that, please?
Taisha, can you?
Hi, yes. For most of the domestic violence cases that we get in the 19th precinct, I can say that some order protections are refrained from, whereas the offender can go back home, but they're refrained from harassing, aggravating, harassing, assaulting the victim. And if that happens, they will be rearrested again and hopefully will be getting a full stay away order protection. Those are the only cases that I can think of why the offender will be able to go back home is with a refrained order protection.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it really hasn't changed too much. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. And thank you very much. If there any more questions or seeing none, thank you so much to our excellent speakers. It been a very enlightening program, and we have a lot we can work with here for our future programs and our initiatives with the community board. So really grateful for your insights and your contributions and your time with us tonight. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn the program over to Gail now.
Our second topic deals with childcare at public meetings. The City Council staff reached out to community boards the end of September, explaining that they wanted to amend and pass Intro 052-2022 as a phased-in pilot program to make childcare available at public meetings, which might include community boards. A few days ago, we found out that the council actually rescinded this childcare bill. I called council member Caban's office to kind of find out, is it dead? What's happening? Apparently it's not dead. It will be reintroduced, and several other council members participated, including our council member, Julie Menon. And what Peggy and I decided was, this is such a concern. This has been raised often at our board meetings, at other community meetings. So we believe it really makes sense to become proactive in addressing this child care issue. And we'd like to solicit ideas from those present this evening and pass them along to the City Council. Since we know they're going to be taking this up again, there's absolutely no reason for us to not be in the forefront of providing this type of information. I see Ed has his hand up, Ed Hartzog.
Hi, Gail. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Ed.
Hi.
Oh, hi, everybody. Is this when I'm supposed to jump in? And
yes, it is.
share some thoughts. Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay. I did catch the tail end of that last part of your first topic, which is very interesting. That's anyway. So as to childcare, I can just speak as one humble individual who's been on the board about, I guess, 12 years now. Good Lord. Anyway, as many faces I see here know, you've seen my son, Alex, who's now 15, has gone to many community board meetings for the very reason we're having this discussion about childcare. I can tell you as a dad whose wife is a professional here, like many folks on this call I know. Most it's two-parent families on the east side. Two-parent, two-income, that's what I mean. Obviously, two parents, of course. It's tough. And my experience, mine was, I felt a great deal of pressure, frankly, because one, it's unusual for dads for that. We had childcare at home, but I was under a lot of pressure because in order to stay on the community board, I had to go to meetings. And everybody here knows 4, 5, 6 meetings a month. And my son was very young, 4 or 5 years old at the time, coming to community board meetings, the blood center. He knows every Wi-Fi on the Upper East Side, where to go for that, the best ones. So I'm for this kind of thing because I'll tell you, it was tough. One, I got a lot of looks from people, kind of looking at me like, why are you bringing your son? But again, if I didn't go to the meetings, I would have been off the board. There was an implicit Damocles sword hanging over my head. Well, if you don't come to the event, you know, you're not going to get renewed in 2 years, because I won't name names. There are members of the city council who will punish you for that. And you better bring your son or you'll be gone. So I felt I had no choice and he had to come. So I'm all for having this available to people so they don't have that pressure and feel that pressure. And also, you know, it's tough. You know, my son he's able to roll with it, but you know, it's not always easy for kids to roll with it and to be around adults and long community board meetings. And there were times when I had to cut out early because, you know, it got to be 9:30 and, you know, he's 15 now, but back then he's like 7, he's 8 years old. And my wife is texting me, you know, is Alex home? You know, he's got to be to school in the morning and, you know, you can't have him out late at night at these meetings. So I've gone on too long already, but I just wanted to kind of share pressure that you might not hear from people because, you know, I don't want to say it, you know, it sounds, you know, kind of like you're whining and whatever. And that, so you never really talk about these things. I never have because you just roll with it. And you just do what you need to do and get it done. But there was, I will just share that I felt a lot of pressure on it. And listen, I liked having him come. I thought it was good anyway, but I'm sure it affected him going, and he's always asking me when I renew for the community board, are you really going to renew again? So he might not be one of our new members, but anyway, I just wanted to say, I think it's a good idea. I think it would be great. I think it would alleviate a lot of pressure on people who were parents and have small children. And you know, and I don't like again the pressure part from the council members. I really didn't think that was appropriate, but there was no sort of forgiveness there. It's either you come or you don't, and if you don't, there'll be consequences. So I don't think anybody should have to face that in the future. And anything that alleviates that burden for parents, I think would be good. So I'll be quiet and won't go on and on, but I'll hang around. And I'm here even though you don't see me. Oh, I know, quick plug, sorry. For those of you who are on here who were involved in the redistricting and who have a penchant and an idea about affordable housing, I'm sending you an email. Julie Wan was just on New York One, free plug for New York One and Spectrum, on Inside City Hall. Please catch the replay tonight at 11 o'clock. I'll send you the email right now. She was utterly brilliant. And I mention her because she was possibly going to be our council member on the Upper East Side. She's not, but she has given the most articulate explanation of affordable housing and development that I have heard in years, because she has a development happening in her district right now. And I'll leave it to her to be the one saying it. But that's what I'm doing, but I'm listening to you all. And thanks for indulging me for however long I've blathered on. So Peggy, Gail, Alita, everybody, nice to see you all. I'm here with you all, even though you just see the 59th Street Bridge.
Thank you, Ed. Alita?
Thanks. Ed, if you're still around, I don't get Spectrum. I use Verizon. I can't see New York One. So if you could send a clip, a link to a clip, that would be really helpful. And thanks. So about childcare. If you're going to have it at full board meetings, it seems that they need to be at all of the committees because the public has much more opportunity to be involved with the crafting of resolutions or in terms of the points that are covered, issues in whereas clauses at committee level than they do at the full board, where they're limited to 2 minutes at the beginning of the meeting and not as the discussion might progress with respect to resolutions. So that's one thing. In terms of practicalities, it seems that there are insurance issues because once you have kids, there is potentially an issue. What happens if they wander out of the room, if they get hurt, if they cause damage, if they do something else? So there's that issue for expense. And then another issue, and I'm not being a naysayer, just raising some points so they could be raised with the city, is the cost. And it certainly shouldn't come out of community board budgets if community boards make their meetings accessible to families, and that kind of accessibility, it seems, is just as important as accessibility for people who are disabled, that it gives the public an opportunity to be involved in issues that are local and specific to them. But someone has to pay for it, and it should be the city and not community boards. We're already financially strained and we're already staff strained, and the city needs to come up with ways of implementing it that don't put a further burden on community boards. And then what happens in a space where there is no, just from my other work, a breakout room for kids? Where do they go? What if we're at a place where there's only one room, for instance, for the meetings? So there are a lot of logical or logistical issues that the city should be responsible for, but I think it's important to be able to provide it, but there needs to be uniformity, there needs to be consistency, it needs to carry through to every community board around the city. And much the same way as we were calling in the last resolution of the congestion pricing task force with respect to people with disabilities, that if they're summoned downtown within the zone for some kind of state or city access to services, and they shouldn't have to pay the congestion pricing fee to do that, there are people who bring their kids to a public access meeting like community board meeting shouldn't have to pay any expense in order to be able to do that. Of course, as long as we're on Zoom, it's not an issue. And even if we have to meet in person and committee meetings are still in Zoom, it's entirely different. But there's a lot of buzz about meeting again in person. So that's all. Thank you.
Peggy?
Yeah, I want to say that we have found over the years it's very difficult to find building managers who are willing to house our meetings. To begin with, their willingness to provide separate space for childcare is probably around zero. I don't think it would work to try to do that, even though I'm totally in favor of childcare, not only at full board meetings, but at any and all of our committee meetings. We want people to be able we want to encourage more people to participate. And if that requires childcare, then we should provide it. The only way that I could think of that would be very easy to do it is to do it via remote options. And this way, buildings would not be required to provide the facilities. Parents could just stay home, and it would generally, it would foster more participation, I am sure, by people with children. Since that is our goal, I really think that it's incumbent on us to provide recommendations that strongly urge the allowance for remote options for any and all community board meetings. Thank you.
I think that's a good point, Peggy, because of the fact that it's very difficult for parents to get to meetings, particularly as Ed points out, when their children are young. And then there's the additional factor. Let's say we're able to secure a breakout room. Then you need someone who's going to watch the children, particularly if they're younger, and that individual would have to have the correct credentials, because you just aren't going to throw a babysitter in just in case. You want to make sure whomever it is who's watching your child is somebody who has some type of certification. So I think that that's another reason that the hybrid concept probably works the best without having a financial burden on community boards. And certainly we know for the next year or year and a half, there's likely to be that type of a hybrid meeting with part of the board having to be in person and the other part of the board might be excused, whether they have a disability, their elder care, whatever the case might be, and child care could be another factor that we could certainly recommend as they move forward in this interim period to look at other ways of having remote plus in-person meetings, that we recommend that. Does anybody disagree or?
No, I think that it would be my recommendation that we strongly encourage the city council to make to provide for childcare at all community board meetings, including committee meetings. However, that should be for the convenience and the accessibility. It should be through allowing remote options at all of those meetings. I just think that if we don't do that, that there won't be any way to do it because buildings aren't going to provide us with that additional facility. It's even going to be harder for our particular community board to find meetings for the members, given that the New York Blood Center is likely not to be an availability for some time to come.
Exactly.
So, I mean,
Alita? I see Alita's hand up.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if thank you. I just wanted to say that you should make it clear, I think, to the city council that the costs of these kinds of Zoom meetings, because they do make it more accessible, should be borne by the city and not by the community board. Because when we had Channel 13 coming in live streaming before COVID, it was at our expense, or it was through grants to this community board. So I think that it's important for the city to cover anything that might be associated with that. Thanks.
Good suggestion.
Could we have a resolution affirming our strong desire for childcare at all community board meetings in New York City with the cost covered by city funds?
Okay.
The general funds?
As long as I'm still unmuted, I'll propose a resolution that there should be childcare available through having Zoom access or some kind of virtual access to meetings, and that the costs, I'm sorry about the background spam call inevitably, that it's then that the cost for such virtual streaming should be, and interactive streaming should be borne by the city, because it's important for people to be able to not just watch, but participate. Thank you. I'm going to mute myself for the phone.
Okay, are there any additions or suggestions to the resolution? If not, Saida, could you call the roll of CB members present?
Or we could do it.
No, it's fine. Okay. I think Elizabeth is with, okay, I think she's back. Okay, we have Elizabeth Ashby, Alita Camp, Ed Hartzog, Sandrea Coleman, Gail Barron, and Margaret Price.
Thank you.
Okay, is anyone opposed, not voting for cause, or abstaining?
Did you
If
have a
so,
second? Was there a
Do you have
second?
I second it.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
Seeing no hands raised, then the resolution has passed. And thank you all for the discussion on childcare and your very pertinent questions on domestic violence, and for joining us tonight. We appreciate it, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much to one and all, and see you all soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Mhm.